Welcome back to the Turnaround Boardroom. I am your host, Paul Maskill, and this podcast is for home service business owners who want to understand their numbers better. We're going to stop lying to ourselves. We remove our emotions, remove our ego, and all the excuses that we make up and let the numbers guide us. We focus on helping home service business owners create predictable profitability and consistent positive cash flow. Today, we have with us a financial expert, and we're going to learn how they actually look at your business from a number standpoint. Again, all of our episodes is discussing real things that happen in real businesses. Nothing discussed should be considered financial, legal, or tax advice for your situation. Every business, including yours, is different. Today, we have with us Taylor Hess. Taylor is an M&A advisor and former investment banker who helps owners of small and lower middle market businesses understand, prepare for, and successfully navigate their exit path. He specializes in practical, seller-focused advice that demystifies valuation, timing, and the exit process for owner-operators. Taylor, excited to have you. Give our listeners a little insight in what do you do on a daily basis?
Yeah, thank you, Paul. Appreciate it. Grateful to be here. I guess on a daily basis, it is a lot of counseling with folks because the process of selling a business is way more emotional than people may tend to want to accept and recognize. So it's effectively taking somebody from, I think I want to sell all the way to the finish line and beyond. And what I do, I consider it, I don't know if this is coined somewhere, but I like to believe I came up with it. I call it goals-based exit advisory. So I'm looking at the whole picture with my clients, not just what can we do with the exit, because everybody wants the most money that they can possibly get. That's a given. But what are you going to do after that? Where are you at with your financial advisor, your CPA, your legal team? How does this fit into your overall portfolio? All that stuff. I like to kind of be holistic and open-minded in my approach. I'm not kind of I don't have a cookie cutter solution for every situation. It is a customized approach for every single business because every business is unique. I mean, it's not like selling a house. You don't just list it and wait for the phone to ring. It is a very invasive process. And if you do it right, it is very time consuming, takes a lot of work, a lot of preparation, a lot of, ups and downs, laughs and cries. And then, of course, you get to the finish line and, have a little celebration and figure out what's next.
Love it. And obviously with the premise of our show, we have quite a few M&A advisors come on, investment bankers, people are, brokers, whatever, a lot of people are playing in that space, especially in the last 4 to 5 years in the home service space, because there is, one, it's the baby boomers and the silver tsunami. 2, it's PE getting involved. So there's just a lot of opportunity for, people like our listeners who have built something of value and now they are at some point in their life that they do want to sell this business and move on. And you had mentioned, I kind of want to get your take on this because everyone has, different experiences, different opinion. But, one of the things you kind of highlighted is what happens post-exit. And a lot of times, business owners just aren't thinking of that because they've been blinders on for so long running their business and, head down, grinding it out. And then all of a sudden one day it's not their business anymore. And it was their baby and they started it and they grew it and they built the teams and the family and all that. So what are some blind spots that our listeners might have that they might just not be thinking about when it comes to, what happens after I sell my business?
Yeah, no, that's a great point and great question. And I think the biggest thing is that sense of purpose, because a lot of folks are building this stuff with, their business with blood, sweat, and tears from the ground up. And they get a sense of purpose and meaning from that business, from that vocation. They're used to pointing the finger and saying, do this, this, and this, and they're greatly needed on a daily basis. And all of a sudden you rip that foundation up and it's very, it's very appealing to say, oh, I'll just go, drink Mai Tais on the beach and, I'll spend my time on the golf course. But from my experience, that gets old pretty quickly. And then folks are kind of like, well, what do I do next? So it's that sense of purpose that I think is the biggest thing that that is subconsciously attached to the business itself, and that's something that I really think should not be overlooked.
Yeah, and that's, I think that's kind of everybody's dream of like, oh, I just want to play golf. I want to sleep in a little bit. I don't want to have to get up at 5 in the morning anymore. I don't want to have to deal with hiring and fire, like all the things that we don't love, and all the things that we wish we could do more of. And then all of a sudden we get the opportunity to do it. And sometimes, like, you know, you and I talk to owners, previous owners, all the time, and like you said, that got old pretty quick. Curious on your take, because a lot of times we're only selling this. We're only selling a business maybe once in a while, maybe twice, but it's a big event. It's a big life change. Have you seen any of even just past clients who, like, you took them all the way through the process? And I know there's some statistics out there as well, but just curious on how many times does a business owner finally sell their business, and then 3, 6 months down the road, they're like, man, I really wish I wouldn't have done that. Because, a lot of times we get all excited, like you said, it's all emotional, and then the dust settles and we might have kind of a little crisis on our hands. So what has been your experience doing what you do? Just, connecting with past owners on what kind of regrets do they might have after selling their business?
The folks that I've worked with, fortunately, we've kind of prefaced a lot of that on the front end, and a lot of them are already at retirement stage, or they may be semi-retired as they're already operating the business. So turning over the keys, can be not as big of a, punch in the gut when they end up doing it. But I'd say it is a very, very common thing for people to look back, and I wouldn't say they come and they say, I regret selling. It's I don't know what to do now. So it's if it's not thought all the way through of, well, I can only play golf so much before I'm going to want to go back into stuff, or I'm going to be getting phone calls from things that I want to dive in and help with. Those people are, everybody's different. I have had owners that are done, and when they get out, they are, at least from what I've gathered, I know a few of them that are totally just thriving because, like I said, they were already pretty much out to begin with. So it all depends. It's case by case.
Yeah. So, and that's a good point of, depending on where you're at in the business, and we'll kind of get into, what makes a business super sellable, but obviously a big part of that is owner dependency. If the business isn't dependent on the owner anymore, they might already be playing golf a couple times a week, and they might already be traveling and doing the things they want to do. But I think, to your point, Taylor, the key is to, like, take the time to really think that through of, when do I want to sell? What's the right time? What's the right dollar amount? And then what am I going to do after? And what's, my purpose in this next stage of life? So when you receive a deal or potential deal, what's the first thing you look at, when someone comes to you?
Well, it's funny. The one of the first questions that I ask in every initial encounter is to what you just mentioned. What would happen if you took a 3-month vacation? And that is very telling how folks answer. If people laugh at that question, then that gives me my answer. I've had people say, yeah, it'd be okay, but the owner dependency is huge, because what is the asset that you're really selling if it is tied to the owner? If the owner is the asset, then they should probably be considering staying on in some capacity for a period, which is its own challenge, because it's kind of like giving your kid up for adoption and then going and living in the house with the new family. It's going to be a big shock one way or the other, no matter how you skin it. But it's important to think about what those outcomes look like, and think through each potential outcome and what you're okay with, what you're not okay with, and just have somebody who's really kind of been through it before, who's holding your hand through the process. Because going through it alone is taxing, to say the least.
So when people come to you, obviously not all the conversations are super positive. Sometimes it's, hey, you got to go do this before your business is sellable. in your opinion, all your experience, not just doing investment banking, but now running your own firm, what's kind of like the you know minimum revenue that you see businesses get to when the owner actually isn't, because obviously that's one of the big things the buyer's looking for, whether it's PE or another buyer, whoever's doing the acquisition. What's kind of like a revenue mark that, because where I see a lot of owners, buyers, sellers kind of get in a little bit of a disagreement is the owner's like, I only work like 10 hours a week. And then you follow around that owner and he's like working like 50 hours a week. So
Yeah.
what's kind of a revenue range that at that point it's like, okay, we should be able to, quote unquote, not have the owner as involved, and it's an actually attractive asset for somebody to buy, knowing they're not just buying a job?
That's a tough question to say on a revenue basis. But I'd say, maybe somewhere between $5 and $10 million if the business is highly dependent on you and you are required on a daily basis and you can't go anywhere without your phone, there's an issue. And that is something to address sooner rather than later.
Yeah, and I think that's, you probably know within a week of, probably know within a day. If you can't thrive, if the business can't thrive for you without a day, let alone 3 months, it's definitely a big issue. So let's start getting into the numbers. What are some of the first things you look at from a number standpoint when you're evaluating a business for potential sale?
Yeah, so I mean, we'll look at, obviously we'll pull financials and we'll dive into those. I think that's probably where most deals fail, is by having sloppy accounting or inconsistencies in the bookkeeping. So that's always something that I know that you preach, and we try to ring the bell as much as we can on having clean financials. But it's going to be, I'm more of a generalist, so the metrics that I may look at may be different, on business to business. So in the home services space, I mean, there's going to be different things that I think are going to be critical, but I try to take um, a very creative look. Well, I would say, customized look for each business where, it is obviously, what's your revenue, what's your profit, what are your gross margins, net margins, what are you doing with, your personal expenses, how much are, run through the business. But taking a look at financial statements can point a lot of that stuff out pretty quickly. But a lot of it at the same time can just be window dressing. And until you peel back the layers of the onion, you don't really necessarily know what's going on from a financial perspective. Um, but obviously, I want to see year over year growth. I want to see margin expansion year over year, and I want to see increased I mean, growth across the board, but sustainable growth with systems that are also being built along the way, so that when somebody does come in and buy something, the knowledge isn't all stuck in the owner's head or just the employee's head.
Yeah, and you had mentioned, kind of like the window dressing, or once you start digging in, maybe it's not as good as, the owner thinks. I'm guessing you've had your fair share of conversations when someone comes to you and they think their business should be worth this, and then you kind of have to tell them it's actually this because of this. What's like a few things that you see, pretty quickly you can spot and be like, oh, this is probably not as good as the current owner thinks it is.
Yeah, there's a lot of having to call people's babies ugly, which I hate doing, but better hear it from me than from a buyer when you're halfway through diligence, of course. I'd say some of the flags that I see are the drastic inconsistencies year over year for certain expenses. That's probably one of the biggest flags that I'll see, or that they're taking on debt that they really don't necessarily need to be taking on, but they've chosen that because it's the easier route to support growth or to help float the company when there's a more um, systemic problem underneath everything. So I think it just, it all depends on the situation. And, looking at a set of financials is only going to tell so much. It tells a lot, but there's also a bunch of, additional questions that I want to know. But again, how much are they are they running personally through the company? Are they living out of the company? Are there, everybody wants to be, creative and, advantageous when it comes to taxes, but is there, I mean, is there fraud happening? Is there blatant, cheating of the IRS and that sort of stuff? That those kind of things are indicative of deeper problems. And usually when you find, when there's smoke, there's fire. So if there's a couple of flags, and any buyer is going to look at it the same way. If they see two or three things that are off, they're going to say, okay, well, maybe this isn't something we want to pursue because these may just be the two or three things that we found, not necessarily the things that are all there. So people may walk just at first glance if, things don't smell right. And, I think, the financials is always where it starts. And anybody who talks to a buyer, buyers are constantly soliciting business owners to make acquisitions directly. And, the first questions they'll ask are, send me over the financials. And unfortunately, a lot of owners don't know any better and they just send them on over and they, think, okay, why not? But, there should be an intermediary in place. There should be, obviously an NDA that should go without saying, but, I find it very common that people don't sign NDAs. There should absolutely be an NDA in place. And then those financials should not be sent to any prospective buyer before they are heavily scrutinized and reviewed by somebody who's an objective third party.
Yeah, so let's kind of go down that rabbit hole a little bit, and then we'll come back to some other things that you brought up as well. One, I do love the idea of how you do anything is how you do everything. If they see a couple inconsistencies, either the value of your business is going to go way down, or they're just going to realize, wow, if this is what we found at first glance, I don't want to know what the actual inner workings of that business looks like. So, talking about intermediaries, if I had to guess, 99% of the people listening to this right now have received emails, phone calls, mailers, postcards from buyers, from ETA people, from private equity companies of,
Yeah.
we want to buy your business.
Yeah.
What are some things that they should, you've already alluded to a couple, sign an NDA, don't just send over your financials, vet them. But obviously the number one answer is, hey, hire someone like Taylor, hire an M&A advisor, hire someone to be that intermediary. But even just like first steps, what are some just red flags that our listeners, might not know are red flags when they start receiving this solicitation from these organizations, people, businesses, PE, all of the above?
I think it's very wise as an owner to be cautious of anybody approaching you to buy your business because there's a lot of wolves in sheepskin, masquerading around as the good guy who, we'll come in, we'll take care of your employees. We're founder friendly, and there's all these talking points that come through, and it sounds really, really good. So it's really difficult, I'd say, for an owner who's not in the business of transacting businesses to flesh that stuff out, which is why I think it's incredibly important to have somebody as a advisor. You wouldn't go into a courtroom without an attorney if if you're smart. So why would you have, an inclination to go into the largest transaction potentially of your life without some sort of representation? And if you have somebody that gets brought in further down the process, they're less effective in what they can actually bring to the table.
Yeah, that's well said. The sooner the better. So you had mentioned something there about founder friendly, and obviously a lot of times when a business gets acquired, the founder, the owner, somebody usually has to stay on for at least several years to facilitate the transition, especially in the trades, whether it's a licensing thing or they've been doing it for 30 years and they want that person there, if they're doing a roll-up strategy, whatever it might be. But what are some things to look for when our listeners are going through that potential transaction and the buyer wants them to stay on? What have you seen work really well when that buyer does stay on, post close?
What
Or the
seems
seller, sorry, when the seller stays on, stays on post close. What are some success stories, or what are some things that make those things work really well?
The most successful scenarios are when you have enough face time with the potential buyer on the front end before you close the deal. Because, in a normal process, it's, you're really only having a couple of meetings with the, directly with the owner of the, or the buyer. So, 4 or 5 dates is really not enough to know whether or not you want to get married to that person. And, when you sign an LOI, that's not getting married, that's, the engagement ring. And it's very, very important to be uh, interviewing them and diving into their culture, talking to owners of other businesses that they've acquired, and doing as much due diligence on them as they're doing on you. And what's interesting about M&A from a sell side is it's counterintuitive. A lot of owners think that, well, I have to, I got to find the right buyer. Well, that's only part of the equation. It's really not difficult to find a buyer, but finding the right buyer is very very important to focus on, because you have, as the seller, the dynamic is you're selling an asset to somebody. They really need to, you're gonna in a good process, you're gonna go out and you're gonna solicit multiple people, and you're gonna get a handful of offers in your hand. So you're gonna have 4 or 5, 6 people that are serious bidders that you get to choose from. So in that case, as the seller, you're effectively the buyer, because you're choosing, who you want to come in and be the steward of your business and your legacy. So, interviewing them, asking them difficult questions, pin them against the wall, and remember that, you hold all the cards up until the LOI is signed. Once the LOI is signed, leverage shifts entirely. It's a whole different discussion, because then you're lifting the skirt and you have to show them every single thing about the business. And if things are not negotiated correctly in the letter of intent, then it's the buyer. The buyer is the one who presents the purchase agreement, and so the buyer will put in the terms that have not been identified and have not been discussed on the front end in the agreement on the back end. And at that point, you're arguing on your heels, because you've already shown them all of your data. They know who your customers are. They know, everything about your company. So, getting ahead of that kind of stuff, and having somebody to kind of hold your hand through that and say, this buyer has a good track record. This one has no track record, and there's different buyer profiles and buyer types as well. And that's also important to understand, which is, another distinction we're happy to dive into. But I'd say, the work on the front end as a buyer, as a seller, understanding that you have the leverage, and, if a deal doesn't work for one party, it doesn't work at all. So you have to make sure that it is good for you as much as they're trying to make sure it's good for them.
Yeah, and I think sometimes, we as sellers, we might overlook that because we get so caught up in all the other stuff, like, ooh, let's look at the numbers, right? Like you said, if there's gonna be 5, 6 offers, what one actually works for you, not just from the numbers standpoint, but also, what does it look like? Who's taking over, like you said, the steward of their legacy and all that. So definitely some good insight there. So what has been your experience? What kills more deals? Is it bad operations and systems, or is it bad financials? Where have you seen deals, kind of go sideways more often?
It's certainly number one is on the financials, because when diligence kicks off, they're digging into way more than you think they are. They're not just coming in and looking at a couple of things. And as a small business owner, who's clawed their way up to 3, 5, $10 million in revenue through, a series of $10, $20 million, or $20,000 bets along the way, is a totally different animal than a buyer coming in and making a $5 or $10 million bet. And so they're digging hard, and they're digging heavy into every single thing that happens. I've seen third party items also be a really big issue, at least in prolonging deals, or potentially killing deals, whether that be a landlord not willing to sign consent over for the lease to a new buyer, or even attorneys. If you have the wrong, legal counsel, just say, I'll use my estate attorney, or I'll use, this general attorney who's not actively transacting businesses, who may pull, agreements from a deal that they did back in 2003. That's not necessarily going to work. And I've seen attorneys unfortunately kill deals because, they're a lot of times they're more motivated to, which is, ethically makes sense, to protect the client. But a lot of times that could lead to them protecting the client at the expense of the deal itself. So you want an M&A attorney who specializes in transactions, who is, knows how far to push, knows when to stop pushing and wrap it up. Because if they're just charging on the hour, the other opposing counsel, it's the same thing there. I mean, there's been a number of cases where, actually, in most cases, at some point, you got to tell I have to step in and say, hey, call off the dogs. We've beaten this to death. Let's move on here, because, if you let them go forever, certain attorneys will argue over, commas and periods. And at that point, it's like, the deal fatigue is so real that, buyers or sellers may be just willing to walk away and say, I'm not doing it, because back to the emotional component of it, you're still trying to run a business as a seller. You're trying to run that as if nothing's going to happen. And that's the way you should do it when you go through the process, is act as if the deal is not going to happen. And part of that is you're not telling your employees, you're keeping it a secret. So you're still running the business on a day-to-day basis, but in the background, you're doing more work than you've done in maybe ever, because it's not like just getting a mortgage. It's, the way I put it is like getting a mortgage, where they go through your underwear drawer and then some. It's like that times 20. It is very, very invasive. And I think folks that are not prepared to do that alongside running the business get deal fatigue. And, it's like this old saying goes, time kills all deals. So, being prepared on the front end, extremely important, and having somebody who can step in and be the quarterback and the bulldog on your behalf to, like I said, call off the dogs when the time is there. And also, if something doesn't smell right and you're selling the business doesn't smell right with the buyer, it could be prudent to, walk away as the seller. So it's important to know that knife cuts both ways. If they come back and they say, hey, we're going to give you a 30% haircut. We'll still do the deal, but it's 30% less on the purchase price. And, there's not merit behind it. You don't have somebody to tell you that that's, BS. You may, those are the situations where a lot of folks end up regretting, not having hired representation or regretting selling the company. So there's a lot of ways it can go down.
Yeah, and I think that, even just goes back to the deal fatigue. If, the seller's just like, fine, whatever, just do it. I'm tired of doing it.
Yep.
We'll take the 30% less just to keep moving forward, versus having someone else have a lot of those conversations on your behalf. So, I think a big overarching theme, guys, for all of this is making sure your data is accurate, making sure it makes sense, and making sure you're running your business like a business that you would actually want to buy as a buyer someday. Because a lot of times, like you said, we treat our business like a piggy bank, and we're not operating optimally, which obviously really decreases the value of it. But then the other part of that, where I see a lot of business owners, they just don't know what they don't know, is your bookkeeper's not doing you any favors if they're not doing everything the right way, as if what's going to happen when it comes to quality of earnings and due diligence. So guys, it is so important to have a really good bookkeeper who understands your industry and making sure everything's accurate. So that way, whenever you do go sell your business, because like Taylor said, they're going to go back and it's like, they're going through everything. They're not just going to look at what you did yesterday, right, from a super high level. They're going to look at what you did the last however many years to really get comfortable. Like Taylor said, they're making a $5 to $10 million investment. They're going to make sure that they're getting a return on that. So with that being said, Taylor, what are the top 2 or 3 things, at least at the first, the first start of every deal? What are the main things that a potential buyer's actually looking at or looking for?
I'd say the top 2 are going to be clean financials and owner dependency. I'd say those are probably the top 2, and as a third one, probably customer concentration. So if all your customer is 50% of your revenue tied up in one customer with no contract, that's a personal relationship of the owner, probably not very good, and is going to be a tough bridge to cross when it comes to structuring the actual transaction. The financials, we can beat that horse to death, but I think both you and I would agree that having not just clean financials from a bookkeeping perspective, but clean financials that a buyer is going to look at and accept Because you mentioned, all running our businesses, is our own personal piggy bank. That's very true, and buyers expect that, to some degree. So there's going to be add backs that, will, your personal vehicle or family pay that, somebody who's not really working in the business, you get to add back that into the profit. So I wouldn't say be afraid of putting personal expenses through the company. They expect that. It would be, it's rare that I see somebody who doesn't do that, but being able to clearly stand behind the numbers that are presented, is very, very important. And that owner dependency, it really can't be, overstated. I mean, they're, and it's not just the owner, it's key personnel as well. And I know that, it's a lot of folks think that, I'm selling my business, they can hire new people, but in, a lot of buyers' mind, it's, I'm buying the people, because the people are what make the machine run. And so the people need to also be, that have at the very least the transferable knowledge, that's documented somewhere, employee handbooks, standard operating procedures, and that sort of thing, and making sure that, that they can move on with the new company as well.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. So, last question, Taylor, as we start to wrap this up, there's plenty of people listening to this podcast. They're doing, call it, $3 to $10 million in revenue. They don't really have their books cleaned up. The business still runs through them, even if they're telling, even if they try and convince themselves it's not. But I have these conversations a lot of times where they say, well, once we get, say they're at 5 million, once we get to 10 million, then we'll solve that problem. And we'll, then we'll pay to get our books cleaned up. I don't have time to do that right now. Or once we get there, then I'll have the revenue to hire the people to replace me. But right now, I don't need to focus on that. I just got to keep going, going, going. What do you tell those people? Because I'm sure you have these conversations when they come to you trying to sell their business. And you're like, yeah, it's not going to work. What do you tell those people who think, I'm going to go get more revenue and then eventually I'll go solve these two big problems?
Revenue may solve the problems of your business as you're operating it, but it's not going to solve the problem down the road when you go to sell it. It's going to expose a lot of those problems. And if you don't do the work on the front end, you're going to be bitten on the back end. People that have businesses that are, that they, if they have kids, that they have just a inkling of a thought of maybe having them involved in the business one day, then it is, do you want your kids to, your kids may not want to inherit a business that they're seeing their parents grinding for 12, 13, 14 hours a day. And they're going to say, I don't want that life. And then, you're going to find yourself at that revenue goal, but you can't hand it off to your kids. And now you have to go to market, and then you have to start cleaning up. And the cleanup process, they're going to be a 3 to 5 year look back of historical. So you can't just put lipstick on a pig and say, well, just clean up this year. They're going to, buyers are smarter than that. So they're going to go back in depth. But I guess, a question I would ask is, what happens if there's, a health crisis? What happens if you have to sell? Because not everybody sells just when they're ready and when they want to, and when the market conditions are right. What happens if you have to? What happens if there's some geopolitical or legal thing that happens? What happens if you have some major event and, God forbid, in service industry, of course, the liability is high for, say tree care, an employee, gets, massively injured, and all of a sudden your insurance goes sky high, your margins are crushed, you can't afford to continue to run business. There's a million things that can happen along the way. So always preparing your business as if you're going to sell is prudent in any situation, just to give yourself the option. Should push come to shove, you can pull the trigger, and you're pulling the trigger, you're not leaving tons of money on the table. Because in this space, if you do the work on the front end, it is a difference of, 2, 3, multiple millions often of outcome. So it's well worth the time and investment on the front end to do things correctly, to act as if, you are going to sell at some point, and start tightening up things as soon as humanly possible. I know it's tough because it's not something fun. It's not what we want to do. We want to continue growing, making money, and I'll deal with that later. But it is it's just one of those things where you put it off, it's going to come back to bite you.
I think that is great advice for everybody out there to wrap up this podcast with. Build your business to sell, even if you don't want to sell it. There is a great book also called Built to Sell by John Warlow. Recommend y'all check it out. But Taylor is 100% spot on, not only with that of, you're really just in an advantageous position, a lot less stress when you never have to sell your business, but if the right offer comes along, you can, or if there's a major life change where you have to sell your business because you're moving or whatever might happen, it just makes life a lot less stressful. And to hit on that last point about, how many millions of dollars you're leaving on the table, if you're, where you're at, if your business would sell for 5 times EBITDA and you added, even $200,000 to the bottom line, that's $1 million, by getting these things in line sooner rather than later. The best time to make that happen is today. Taylor Hess, thank you for coming on the show and really giving our listeners a whole bunch of wisdom and insight into what goes on to sell a business. If our listeners want to connect with you, what's the best place or best way to do so?
Probably on LinkedIn. You'll see me, Taylor Hess, with Stonebridge Business Advisors. StonebridgeBA.com is our website. Or you can send me an email to taylor.hess@stonebridgeba.com.
Awesome. Love it. We'll link that up in the show notes as well, guys. This is how professionals on the financial side of the trades look at things. If this episode resonated with you and you are ready to get your business financially healthy, you can also head over to the bluecollaradvisors.com. And until next time, make it a great day.